He had wealth, power, and respect. But one secret threatened to bring it all crashing down. And when his young lover demanded to be acknowledged, the millionaire faced a choice: live in truth or silence him forever. Picture this: a man who had everything. Richard Thompson owned half the real estate in downtown Seattle. His charity galas raised millions for children's hospitals. His wife Margaret hosted society events that made the front page of the Seattle Times. But every Wednesday at 3 p.m., Richard would cancel his board meetings, slip out the back entrance of his office building, and drive 20 minutes across town to a modest apartment where 23-year-old Marcus waited for him. No one knew about Marcus. Not Richard's business partners, not his country club friends, and certainly not his wife of 27 years. This wasn't just an affair. This was Richard's carefully guarded secret that could destroy everything he had spent decades building. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But here's what will shock you. This story isn't just about a secret relationship. It's about what happens when shame becomes so powerful that it transforms a respected businessman into something unrecognizable. Who was Marcus really, and why was Richard so terrified of the world knowing about him? What drove a man who had donated millions to charity to make a decision that would leave a young man dead and a family forever broken? Because what investigators uncovered wasn't just a murder. It was a double life so meticulously constructed that even Richard's own children had no idea who their father really was. And when that life began to crumble, the lengths this millionaire went to preserve his image would send shockwaves through an entire community. Let me take you back to where this all began. Richard Thompson wasn't born into wealth. His father worked the docks in Tacoma. His mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. But Richard was different. Even as a child, he understood that appearance mattered more than truth. He studied harder than his classmates, dressed better than his family could afford, and spoke with a confidence that masked the poverty he was desperate to escape. By 35, Richard had built Thompson Real Estate from nothing into a multi-million-dollar empire. He married Margaret Harrison, daughter of a prominent Seattle banking family, in a wedding that made the society pages. They had 2 children, lived in a mansion overlooking Puget Sound, and to everyone who knew them, they were the perfect American success story. Richard served on hospital boards, funded scholarships for underprivileged kids, and was regularly featured in Seattle Business Magazine as a pillar of the community. But success couldn't silence the part of Richard that he'd been hiding since he was a teenager, the part that was attracted to men. In the 1990s, being openly gay wasn't just career suicide for someone in Richard's position, it was social death. So he buried that part of himself, threw himself into building his empire, and convinced himself that a perfect exterior life could make the interior one disappear. That strategy worked for almost 20 years, until he met Marcus Williams. Marcus was working as a server at a high-end catering company when he first encountered Richard at a charity fundraiser in 2010. 23 years old, Marcus had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until he aged out of the system at 18. He was smart, charming, and had the kind of easy smile that made people feel instantly comfortable. But more than that, Marcus saw through the polished exterior that Richard presented to the world. Their first conversation lasted 10 minutes. Richard complimented the presentation of the hors d'oeuvres. Marcus laughed and said he'd never seen someone look so serious about mini quiches. For the first time in years, Richard found himself genuinely smiling. Not the practiced smile he wore in board meetings or at charity galas, but a real one. Within a month, Richard had hired Marcus's catering company for 3 more events. Within 3 months, he was finding excuses to meet Marcus for coffee to discuss business opportunities. And within 6 months, Richard was living 2 completely different lives. The public Richard still attended church every Sunday with Margaret, still played golf at the country club, still gave speeches about family values at charity dinners. But the private Richard spent every Wednesday afternoon and some Saturday mornings in Marcus's small apartment, feeling more himself than he had in decades. They would talk for hours about everything and nothing. Marcus would cook simple meals that tasted better to Richard than any five-star restaurant. And for a few precious hours each week, Richard could stop pretending. But secrets this big never stay contained forever, and the bigger they get, the more dangerous they become. By 2012, what had started as stolen afternoons had evolved into something deeper. Marcus wasn't just Richard's secret. He was the person Richard talked to about his real fears, his actual dreams, the parts of his life that no one else ever saw. But that intimacy came with a price. Marcus was growing tired of being hidden. The fight started small. Marcus would make comments about wanting to meet Richard's friends, about feeling like he was living in shadows. Richard would promise things would be different someday, but someday kept getting pushed further into the future. Marcus was 25 now, watching his friends build real relationships while he spent his holidays alone because Richard was with his family. The tension reached a breaking point on November 15, 2012. Earlier that week, Richard had been photographed at yet another charity gala with Margaret. The Seattle Times ran a full-page spread about the Thompson family's philanthropic work, calling them Seattle's most devoted couple. Marcus saw the article and something inside him snapped. When Richard arrived at the apartment that Wednesday afternoon, Marcus was waiting with the newspaper spread across his coffee table. They argue for over an hour. Marcus demanded to know when Richard was going to stop living a lie. Richard tried to explain about his reputation, his business, his children's futures. But Marcus wasn't hearing it anymore. "I'm done being your dirty secret, Richard. Either you tell Margaret the truth, or I will." Those 9 words changed everything. Richard felt his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse. His mind raced through the implications. Margaret would take half of everything in the divorce. His business partners would distance themselves. His children would be humiliated. 3 decades of building his empire would crumble because of one conversation. "You can't be serious," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life. I deserve better than this. I deserve someone who isn't ashamed of me." What happened next would haunt investigators for months. According to Richard's later testimony, Marcus became increasingly aggressive, threatening to call Margaret that night, to show up at Richard's office, to make their relationship public whether Richard wanted it or not. Richard claimed he was terrified, that Marcus was out of control, that he feared for his safety. But the physical evidence told a different story. If you're still following this shocking story, type, "I'm still here," in the comments so we know who's really watching. The neighbors in Marcus's apartment building remember hearing raised voices around 5:30 p.m. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door, later told police she heard what sounded like furniture being overturned. Then, around 6:15, complete silence. Richard's cell phone records show he left Marcus's apartment at 6:47 p.m. and drove straight home. He arrived in time for dinner with Margaret and their teenage son. He helped his daughter with her algebra homework. He watched the evening news. To his family, it was just another ordinary Wednesday night. But back in the small apartment across town, Marcus Williams was dead. If you're still following this shocking story, type "I'm still here" in the comments so we know who's really watching. Marcus's body was discovered 3 days later when he failed to show up for a catering job. His supervisor, worried because Marcus had never missed work without calling, convinced the building manager to do a welfare check. What they found inside apartment 4B would become the centerpiece of one of Seattle's most shocking murder trials. Marcus was found in his living room, having suffered blunt force trauma to his head from what investigators determined was a heavy glass award, ironically, a community service recognition that Richard had given him as a gift months earlier. The apartment showed signs of a struggle, with overturned furniture and broken dishes scattered across the kitchen floor. Initially, police had no suspects. Marcus's life was relatively simple. He worked for the catering company, had a small circle of friends, and no known enemies. But as investigators began looking deeper into his personal life, they discovered something puzzling. Marcus had been living well above his means. His one-bedroom apartment was in an expensive part of town. His bank account showed regular cash deposits that far exceeded his catering income. He drove a BMW that should have been impossible to afford on his salary. When police asked his friends and co-workers about these discrepancies, they all said the same thing. Marcus had mentioned having a benefactor, someone who helped him financially, but insisted on keeping their relationship private. The breakthrough came when investigators obtained Marcus's phone records. In the months leading up to his death, he had been in regular contact with a number registered to Thompson Real Estate. The calls followed a pattern: short conversations every few days, longer calls on Tuesday evenings, and then nothing on Wednesdays for several hours at a time. When detectives showed up at Richard's office on November 20th, 2012, he was in a board meeting discussing the purchase of a downtown hotel. He was wearing his usual perfectly tailored suit. His voice was calm and authoritative as he discussed multi-million-dollar investments. This was Richard in his element, the respected businessman who commanded respect and wielded enormous influence. But when the detectives introduced themselves and asked if he knew Marcus Williams, something shifted. Richard's assistant later said she'd never seen her boss look so pale. He excused himself from the meeting, led the detectives to his private office, and closed the door. The initial questioning was routine. Yes, Richard knew Marcus. He'd hired his catering company for several events. No, he didn't know much about Marcus's personal life. Yes, it was terrible what had happened. No, he couldn't imagine who would want to hurt such a nice young man. But the detectives noticed inconsistencies immediately. Richard claimed he barely knew Marcus beyond their professional relationship, yet he knew details about Marcus's childhood that weren't common knowledge. He said he hadn't seen Marcus in weeks, but his phone records showed a 40-minute call just 2 days before the murder. More importantly, when asked about his whereabouts on Wednesday afternoon, Richard hesitated just long enough for Detective Sarah Morrison to notice. He eventually said he'd been in meetings all afternoon, but when they checked with his assistant, she admitted his calendar had been mysteriously cleared from 2:30 to 7 p.m. that day. The investigation moved quickly after that. Bank records revealed that Richard had been giving Marcus substantial monthly payments disguised as consulting fees. Security footage from Marcus's apartment building showed Richard's distinctive Mercedes arriving and leaving on multiple occasions, always during the same midweek time slots. But the most damning evidence came from Marcus's laptop. Hidden in a password-protected folder on Marcus's computer, investigators found what could only be described as a digital diary of his relationship with Richard. Photos of them together during what appeared to be weekend getaways, screenshots of intimate text message conversations, and most devastatingly, audio recordings of their arguments. Marcus had been documenting everything for months. Not out of malice, investigators would later learn, but out of a desperate hope that someday he could prove to the world that their relationship was real. The recordings revealed the depth of Richard's internal struggle and the growing frustration in their relationship. In one particularly heartbreaking audio file dated just a week before Marcus's death, you can hear Marcus pleading with Richard. "I'm not asking you to shout it from the rooftops. I just want to be able to hold your hand in public once. I want to meet your friends as your partner, not as the caterer. I'm tired of feeling like I don't exist in your real life." Richard's response was barely audible. "You don't understand what you're asking me to give up." But the recording that changed everything was from the afternoon of November 15th, the day Marcus died. The audio was poor quality, apparently recorded from Marcus's phone that was left on during their final argument. You can hear the escalation clearly. Marcus's voice becoming more insistent, Richard's becoming more desperate. "I've been patient for 2 years, Richard. 2 years of being your secret. I can't do this anymore. Please, just give me more time. I need to figure out how to handle this." Time for what? Time to find a way to make me disappear completely. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Do I? Because that's exactly what it feels like. You want all the benefits of having me in your life, but none of the reality. I'm not a fantasy, Richard. I'm a real person with real feelings. The recording becomes chaotic after that. You can hear the sound of something crashing, Richard shouting, Marcus screaming. Then, abruptly, silence. When confronted with this evidence, Richard's carefully constructed world finally collapsed completely. He broke down in the interview room, admitting to the relationship, but claiming Marcus's death was an accident. According to Richard, Marcus had threatened to destroy his life, his family, his reputation. They struggled over the phone Marcus was using to record their conversation. In the chaos, Marcus fell and struck his head on the coffee table. But forensic evidence contradicted Richard's story. The angle and severity of Marcus's head wounds were inconsistent with a fall. The glass award found beside the body had Richard's fingerprints on it and showed clear evidence of being used as a weapon. Most damning of all, the recording continued for nearly 3 minutes after the struggle ended, capturing Richard's voice as he apparently tried to stage the scene to look like a break-in gone wrong. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Richard Thompson had murdered Marcus Williams to protect his secret and preserve his reputation. This wasn't a crime of passion or a tragic accident. It was cold-blooded murder committed by a man who valued his image more than human life. The defense team, led by one of Seattle's most prominent criminal attorneys, argued that Richard had been living under impossible psychological pressure. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about internalized homophobia, the trauma of leading a double life, and the panic that can result when someone's deepest secrets are threatened with exposure. They painted Richard not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a victim of societal homophobia who had been driven to desperate measures. Yes, he had made a terrible mistake, but it was the result of years of psychological trauma and a moment of complete panic, not premeditated murder. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came not from the prosecution or the defense, but from Marcus himself. 3 days into the trial, Marcus's best friend, Jessica Martinez, came forward with information that changed everything. Marcus had given Jessica a sealed envelope 6 months before his death, with instructions to open it only if something happened to him. Inside was a letter that revealed the true depth of his relationship with Richard, but also something no one had expected. Marcus had been planning to leave Seattle. He had saved enough money from Richard's monthly payments to start over in Portland. He had already applied to culinary school and been accepted. The ultimatum he gave Richard wasn't about destroying Richard's life. It was about freeing himself from it. Marcus wasn't threatening to expose Richard out of spite. He was trying to give Richard one last chance to choose love over fear before Marcus walked away forever. The letter included a passage that brought several jurors to tears. "If something happens to me, I want people to know that I loved Richard with everything I had. I loved him enough to live in shadows for 2 years because I thought someday we could step into the light together. But I can't wait for someday anymore. I deserve to be loved openly and honestly. If Richard can't give me that, I need to find someone who can." This revelation fundamentally changed the prosecution's case. Marcus hadn't been trying to destroy Richard's life. He had been trying to save his own. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Richard's wife, Margaret, attended every day, sitting in the front row with a composure that amazed court observers. Their children, now in college, refused to speak to media, but were seen entering and leaving the courthouse with their mother. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence of premeditation, showing that Richard had researched how to delete phone records and had purchased cleaning supplies the day after the murder. They demonstrated that Richard had lied repeatedly to police, his family, and his business associates. But it was the defense's closing argument that left the biggest impact. Attorney Michael Patterson spoke for over 2 hours about the price of secrets, about the damage that shame can do to the human psyche, about the tragedy of a society that forces people to choose between authenticity and acceptance. Richard Thompson is guilty of many things, Patterson told the jury. He's guilty of cowardice. He's guilty of valuing appearances over integrity. He's guilty of letting fear drive him to make the worst decision of his life. But the question you must answer isn't whether Richard is guilty of poor choices. The question is whether his actions constitute premeditated murder. The jury deliberated for 18 hours across 3 days. When they returned, the courtroom was packed with media, community members, and both families. The foreman stood and delivered a verdict that satisfied no one. Guilty of second-degree murder, Richard was sentenced to 25 years to life. As the judge read the sentence, Margaret Thompson sat motionless in the front row. She never spoke to media, never granted interviews, never offered any public statement about her husband's double life or Marcus's death. But the most powerful moment of the entire trial came during victim impact statements. Marcus's foster mother, an elderly woman named Dorothy, who had taken in dozens of children over the years, spoke directly to Richard. "Marcus used to tell me about this successful businessman who was helping him build a better life. He never told me about the relationship, but he would light up when he talked about you. He said you made him feel valuable, like he mattered. I don't understand how someone who made Marcus feel loved could take that life away. I don't understand how fear could be stronger than love." Richard broke down completely during her statement, sobbing openly in a courtroom where he had maintained composure for 3 weeks. It was the first genuine emotion he had shown since his arrest, and it came too late to save anyone. Today, Richard Thompson is serving his sentence at Washington State Penitentiary. He'll be eligible for parole in 2037 when he's 74 years old. His real estate empire was sold to pay legal fees and settle civil suits. Margaret divorced him quietly and moved across the country with their children, who have both changed their last names. Marcus Williams is buried in a small cemetery outside Seattle, his grave marked with a simple stone that reads, "Beloved son and friend." Dorothy, now in her 80s, still visits every month and leaves fresh flowers. But this case was more than a tragic crime. It was a window into the devastating consequences of living a double life, of letting shame become so powerful that it transforms love into violence. It raised questions about our society's progress on acceptance and tolerance, and it forced a community to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of maintaining perfect appearances. How many other people are living similar double lives right now? How many are struggling with secrets so heavy they can barely breathe? And how many might be pushed to desperate measures because they believe authenticity and acceptance are mutually exclusive? Marcus Williams died because he dared to ask for something that should be every person's birthright: the chance to love and be loved openly. Richard Thompson destroyed 2 lives because he couldn't overcome the shame and fear that society had taught him to feel about who he really was. The real tragedy isn't just that Marcus died, or that Richard will spend the rest of his life in prison. It's that this story could have ended so differently. If Richard had found the courage to live authentically years earlier, Marcus would still be alive. If our society had progressed faster in accepting different forms of love, Richard might never have felt the need to construct such an elaborate lie. What's your take on this case? Do you think Richard deserved the full murder conviction? Or should the circumstances of his psychological state have resulted in a lesser charge? Was justice truly served, or were there really 2 victims in this tragedy? And how do you think we as a society can prevent similar tragedies in the future? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your perspectives always add depth to these discussions. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others. These conversations matter, and the more people engage with these difficult topics, the more we can work toward a world where secrets like Richard's don't have to exist in the first place. And if you thought this case was complex, wait until you hear about the small-town preacher who hid a secret even more shocking, one that involved not just one victim, but an entire congregation. That story is coming next week, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, remember to take care of yourselves and the people you love. Life is fragile, secrets are dangerous, and authenticity, no matter how scary it might seem, is always worth more than the perfect lie.